Classics can feel very intimidating, dense language, hundreds of pages, and the pressure to just get it. But what if reading them could be slow and comforting? What if you didn't have to rush or prove anything? This week, I'm sharing how I'm reading Anna Karenina without feeling overwhelmed, without the guilt, and without the pressure. Let's start. Hi friends, welcome back to the video, welcome back to my bookshelf, and welcome back to my little corner on the internet. My name is Caroline. I am a full-time student with a 9-to-5 job, but also somebody who's love reading and also recently got into content creation. So my entire personality trait is trying to fit reading and content creation into my hectic and busy schedule. I also recently got back into classics and found that they're not as intimidating as people made them to be. And so this video, I'm going to show you how to get into classics without the guilt, without the overwhelming feeling, and without the pressure. This week, we're reading one of my project books of the summer. This is Anna Karenina by Tolstoy. I actually started on this book last night, but not much. I got until page 6. So we're still starting fresh and new with this book. This is one of those books that look very intimidating, and I think this is the biggest and the thickest and the densest classic that I've ever read. So I'm also excited to see how this is going. But first, before we can get into the reading update and the reading tips, I want to debunk some of the myths that we have around classics, because I think having a clear mindset and having the right mindset in terms of reading classics can be very important. So myth number 1 that you could have is feeling like you have to understand everything on the first read. Even though with easier classics, so-called, like Pride and Prejudice, I am 100% sure that I did not get everything in the first read. You can Google, you can reread, you can do lots of different things to make sure that you understand the book. The first read, in my opinion, is just purely based on vibes and purely based on the aspects of the classics that you could understand and you can grasp. Classics are classics for a reason, and they are very dense. They cover lots of aspects of society, and some of those aspects I don't really grasp. For example, political context, that's something that I'm still working on and trying to educate myself more on. Because of that, I tend to skim and skip parts when political context or just politics in general is mentioned. It's not because that I don't value politics in classics, it's just that I don't understand. And if I hyper focus on the political context too much, then I feel like I either might be overwhelmed because I don't understand, or feel like reading is a job instead of a hobby. Myth number 2, you have to start with the hottest book, the biggest book, the thickest book when you first get into classics. I know that sounds very counterintuitive, but some people, when they get into classics, it's either because they don't know where to start, or it's either because they hear that other people have been talking about, for example, Crime and Punishment or War and Peace, and they feel like they can do it as well, which I think you can, but it's gonna take a lot more time for you instead of for other people who have read a couple of classics and have pretty solid understanding about what it feels like to read classics. Classics, they can have different genres and they can have different niches, if you will. The one that I'm reading, this is my first ever Russian literature, but I've definitely dabbled my feet into British literature. That's actually one of my fixations when I first started getting into classics, because I feel like they just speaks to me. So make sure you find something that speaks to you, because classics from different eras and time periods and location around the world, they can have their own distinct themes and topics that they like to cover. For example, in my opinion, British literature, they cover society very well. They have a very great class commentary and structure of society. If that's something that you want to immerse yourself in, I would recommend starting with British literature. You don't have to start with the thickest book, the biggest book, or the book that everybody has been talking about. Make sure you find something in the topic that you are interested in so that it's easier for you to read and get into classics. Myth number 3, this is a very popular one. You are not smart enough for classics. That's completely false. And I think that's one of the reasons, if not the biggest reasons, why people are not reading classics more. That's actually what I thought when I first started getting back into reading, or even before. But I think classics are very, very funny. They're very smart, intelligent, very witty, and they have a way of words that could really challenge us. They can make a story of two people and their life and their love relationship into something that's more complex, that's more societal, that's more reflective on the world in general. And I think that's something that really should be appreciated more about classics. Debunk the myth. You are, and you are capable. You can read classics as long as you have the will to read classics. You will find a way to read classics. The 4th myth that I hear going around is that you are slow reading. You can rephrase that into you are deep reading. I think a single adjustment in terms of your mindset can really make a difference. And I used to feel feel like I have to read that book in a certain deadline. I have to read that book in like 5 days, which I feel like that is not the case. So when I was taking a bit more time to read that book, I started feeling guilty because why am I not reading it fast enough? You know what I mean? That feeling. And why am I taking so much time to read this book? So instead of feeling like you're not reading fast enough, I feel like you should reframe it into saying, oh, I'm reading deeply. I want to understand what this is saying. I want to really get down to the nitty-gritty and really kind of pull apart the bigger themes, the bigger bullet points, if you will, of the book and what the author is trying to comment on. So those are some of the myths that I've seen going around, or some of the myths that I myself have felt before I get into reading classics, and that hopefully can help reframe your mindset. So now that we have debunked some of the myths surrounding reading classics, the first tip that I have for you is try to at least have a basic understanding about the era and the time period that the book is set in. Basically meaning you should do some research beforehand. This doesn't have to be an extensive research. These books are classics for a reason. They are very important to the era, but they are also important for humanity in general. The first thing that I advise people to do is to read the introduction of the book. There's always going to be an introduction at the beginning, also with the translator notes. But I think the introduction will give you a very solid understanding about the place that the book is set in, the time period, and some of the bullet points and the key beliefs of the people around that time. But for me, usually I don't like to start with the introduction. I tend to read the introduction last. So after I finish the text itself of the book, I go back and read the introduction, because that way I feel like it gives me some discussion points, some things to think about, and really piece together the bigger picture. So that's something that I usually don't do, like reading the introduction first, but I feel like some people that works very well for them. So depending on if you are that person who wants to read the intro first or intro last, read the intro regardless. Another way that you can do research on the context is to search up on Google. For example, this book that I'm reading, Anna Karenina, is set in Russia in the 18th century. So I just Google Russia, late 18th century summary, and I could really get a solid understanding about the political context and what's going on around that time. I found one essay that did a really good job at kind of summarizing the book without giving away the plot. So I'm going to put it up on the screen. They give an introduction, they give you each of the themes that were discussed in Anna Karenina, and then the key takeaways of the book. I think that's a very useful understanding coming into the book. I think classics are one of those books that you need to have a basic understanding, even though that might spoil the plot for you, but I feel like it's worth spoiling the plot for. And then another thing is watch a one short video essay on YouTube about the historical context. If you're not a reading person, you can watch some videos. I found some videos just by typing in Anna Karenina historical analysis or historical summary, and there's a bunch of videos coming up. It's also useful if the author that you're reading from, if they have some short stories or novellas outside of this novel. I think that's a great way to also familiarize yourself with the writing and the style of the author. But keep in mind, even after you've done some research, you don't have to know everything about the era and the time period to be able to enjoy the book. Okay guys, I have an update in terms of Anna Karenina. I am about 180-ish pages into the book, 188, that much into the book, and I thought I would give you a bit of an initial impression on what this book felt like. This book surprised me, to be honest. It was rather easier to read than I thought. Going into this book, I was expecting something that's pretty rigid and hard, but I feel like his language was very flexible. His writing style was very flexible. At times, it was very abrupt and very straightforward, very rigid, very kind of solid in a sense, but then other times when he was describing, for example, the sceneries, the winter, and then how spring comes, his writing style was very much poetic and very much vivid, descriptive. It did take me a while to reach even page 100. The first couple of pages, it was kind of shocking because I kind of understood what was going on. There were already so many characters being introduced that I had to like physically and mentally keep tabs. I made sure that whenever I encounter a name or character, I made sure to to circle, underline, highlight, whatever, to make sure that I kind of imprint them into my head, if that makes sense. This reminds me a lot about Vanity Fair and even Wives and Daughters, but mostly Vanity Fair because it's also set in the same small but not so small society of upper class people and their gossip, their problems. We opened the story with a story about Stefan Arkadieck. Hopefully I'm pronouncing his name correctly. If not, then you would have to excuse me. But Stepan, he is a prince, and obviously he's a very upper class, very wealthy, noble person. But we opened the story knowing that he recently got into a love affair. He betrayed his wife. So opening the book, it was a conflict and fight between Stepan and his wife. Stepan's sister is coming in a couple of days to help them get over the argument and help them maybe understand each other more. We were not introduced to Anna Karenina until page 100 or something. All we knew about Anna was through other people's recollections of her and perspective of her, and that I think was a very interesting angle to tell the story from. There also is a lot of commentary on wealth and class, and let me read you that passage that I highlighted. So this is Levin, which is another protagonist. I think he owns land and he does a lot of farming and domesticate animals and growing wheat. The other aristocrat, they look at Levin and they don't value him as much. They're having this conversation about what it means to be aristocratic and what it means to be noble and wealthy and of rank. So this is Levin speaking. Aristocratism, you say, but allow me to ask, what makes up this aristocratism of Vronsky or whoever else it may be? Such aristocratism that I can be scorned. You consider Vronsky an aristocrat, but I don't. A man whose father crept out of nothing by willingness, whose mother, God knows who she didn't have liaisons with. Excuse me, but I considered myself an aristocrat, and people like myself who can point out to 3 or 4 honest generations in their families past, who had a high degree of education, and who never lowered themselves before anyone, never depended on anyone, as my father lived and my grandfather. Interesting commentary, and that speaks volumes about each of their own qualities and personalities and characteristics. To be honest, I've grown quite fond of Levin, Anna Karenina. I don't like her that much, to be honest, even though I know she's the title of the book. But yeah, anyway, that's a very long update, but that's my first impression of Anna Karenina. I'll continue reading and I'll catch you in a second. The next tip that I have in terms of reading classics is picking the right translation for you. Each of those translations will have slightly different variation of the text. Some can focus on preserving the original meaning of the text, and they can compensate that with the comprehension of the text. And then vice versa, some focus on making sure that this work of literature is very accessible to modern readers, that they can sometimes compensate the original meaning of the text. So in terms of Anna Karenina, I think they have 4 translations that I want to mention. The one that I have is Pavir, hopefully I'm pronouncing his last name correctly, and Volokonsky translation, and I know that this one is known for is staying very close to the original Russian text, so it means that this could be pretty hard to read, especially if you're a beginner. So this is good if you want a even scholarly experience, a very authentic experience, an experience that's very close to the original text. Another translation is the Garnet translation. I'm gonna put the picture on the screen. This is one of the earliest English version, and so it's a very classic, if that makes sense. This is good for if you want to feel a traditional atmosphere, a very classic early English translation. But some critics say that the translator may have flattened Tolstoy's style, so just keep that in mind. The next translation that you could check out is the Bartlett translation. This is a newer translation with elegant and modern clarity. So if you are somebody who are a bit intimidated by older translation, this might be the one for you. But once again, some critics say that it's rather smooth over and it loses that rigidity of Tolstoy's writing style. The last translation that I want to mention is the Schwartz translation. This translation is known for its modern and vivid, and it has a more emphasis on Tolstoy's emotional range. So it's good if you want something that's still modern but still pretty serious and has that unique rigidity of Tolstoy's writing. So those are the translations that I wanted to mention. So how to pick the right translation for you. I think the biggest thing is to read a sample text of each of the translation to find out which one feels the most natural to you, and also make sure that you understand what is your goal in terms of reading that particular book. Is it you want to get as close to the original text as possible, or is it that you want to just have an accessible and easy read? Also check for reviews on whatever buying platform that you want to buy and purchase from. Go to TikTok and see what other people are saying about that particular translation that you're wanting to pick. I am on page 374, almost halfway through the book. I will give another update when I'm like halfway-ish. So far, it's been very insightful. This one is like, I would say, dripping knowledge and commentary and reflection on this time period that I found so fascinating, but also very relevant. Tolstoy makes insightful comments on, for example, farming techniques and how that plays a role in politics, the economy. It talked about like the emancipation has ruined Russia because back then Russia had a serfdom. From what I understand, do correct me in the comment section if I'm wrong, but this is what I envision it to help me understand this concept a lot more easier. But I would say serfdom is very similar to the slave system in the United States. The enslaved people, they would work for the landowners and the plantation owners. This is very similar in that sense. Page 331, that's when Tolstoy kind of introduced these two different landowners with opposing ideologies and views about this specific problem. The discussion about farming and agriculture was so much in this book, but I weirdly found that to be very fascinating. Oh, there's also comments on morality. For example, quote, "This ability to act for the common good was perhaps not a virtue, but on the contrary, a lack of something. A lack of life force, of what is known as heart, of that yearning which makes a man choose one out of all the countless paths." So this is talking about the concept of wanting to do good because they think that is the right thing to do instead of actually feeling and wanting and yearning to do the good deed. Even if somebody thinks that it's logically good and they follow through with the good deed versus somebody who's like born to be a good person from their heart and their soul, and can they be at the same level in terms of their morality, or should we weigh one over the other, or should we value the one that's like good from their heart better or more valuable than the other person who's just like logically thinking that it's good? I have been very enjoying it, although I'm reading a bit slower than usual. It takes me 4 days to get to not even the halfway mark, but I'm savoring this book. Okay, the next tip, which is a pretty obvious one, is to make sure you annotate the book whenever you're reading any classic. You can either annotate circling, underlining, highlighting the characters to make sure that you have a solid understanding of what are the characters, because sometimes classics, they have a pretty wide range and wide cast of characters. Also keep a book journal or a dedicated place where you highlight the quotes, your reflection, your thoughts on each of the passage, on each of the sentence that you feel resonate a lot with you. And I think keeping a book journal helps you deep read, think of questions, help you reflect on the book more often. This is one of the tips that I am still working on. I do have a book journal, but I feel like annotating directly into the book, where I would stick post-it notes in, I would do a little summary after every single chapter directly in the book itself, really helps, and it also keeps everything in the same place. So if you're new to annotate, I have a couple of tips to help you get started. The first thing is pick one or two themes or two things to track. You cannot track every single themes in, for example, Anna Karenina or any other classic. I usually go into the book pretty blind, but then as I read, I can pick out what this book is about, and then I will decide pretty early on which of the themes I'm gonna focus on. So it's more of a go with the flow approach. But if you want to go into the book knowing what themes are available, like I mentioned, that article that I had up on the screen is very useful in having a summary of the themes being covered in the book, and that you could read a little analysis of each of the theme and then decide for yourself which themes you can and you want to track. Use a color code, or at least a system. I don't use color coding, I think that's just very distracting, but I have a list of symbols that I usually follow to make sure that I highlight accordingly. Usually when it comes to characters, I usually circle the characters, quotes, or for passages that I feel like are just absurd or are just like very, very important, very resonating with me. Then I either have exclamation point and then underlining as well. Whenever I feel like I want to underline, I would just underline. There's not a pretty set system for me me per se. I just go with the flow. But I would recommend having at least a symbol or a system where you follow to highlight or to underline or whatever system you have. Make sure that you feel like you resonate, and whenever you look back the book, it's gonna be very legible and comprehensible to you and you only. And the last thing in terms of annotating is that I have something that's pretty unique to me, at least, is that I write in the margins. But I don't only write or highlight and make notes in the margin. I write in the margin as if I'm communicating with the author. I'm gonna put questions like, oh, why does Tolstoy use this word? Oh, this is a very interesting structure. This is a very interesting choice of syntax. This is a very interesting diction that the translator is using. So make sure that you are also immersing yourself in the story by kind of communicating. I think that's a very great way to make sure that you are, once again, analyzing the characters, analyzing Tolstoy, the author, or just like questioning. That's where the question log that I mentioned comes into place. And later when I do a second read, when I come back to Anna Karenina, I have all of those questions written in the margins, and then I could start answering those questions to the best of my ability. And I feel like that's just a very holistic and immersive experience when reading classics. But then remember that annotation is not a test. You don't have to make sure that your annotation is neat, is tidy. Nobody's gonna read it except from you. That's why I mentioned that this is a very intimate and personal experience. So whatever feels natural to you, whatever speaks to you, whatever methods, whatever way of annotating speaks to you, then by all means go ahead. Even though I don't use tabs, and I'm still on the fence of using tabs, but if you feel like romanticizing and making sure that reading is an aesthetic works for you, then by all means, buy all the tabs, color coding, and do whatever you need to do. I'm at the halfway mark of Anna Karenina. I'm on page 416, and I wanted to give you a bit of a halfway reading update. I'm very much enjoying this story. I feel like it's such a good commentary on just like everything in life. This is a story that follows two protagonists. We have Anna Karenina, but also Konstantin Dmitrik Levin. But I feel like Levin is the main protagonist. The book opened with Anna Karenina having an affair with another man named Vronsky on her husband. So we were following her in terms of that, then realizing how at this point that I was reading, her decision to break it off with her husband was eventually a wrong one, and how her husband Alexei Alexandrovich finally learned to forgive. And at this point, this very interesting effect that forgiving and forgiveness in general can have on a person, because before Alexei Alexandrovich, so her husband, he never learned to care for other people's emotions. He was very cold, rather indifferent. He never shows his emotions. So that's why people perceive him to be very cruel, very selfish, very mean. But now that he learns to forgive her, even for her wrongdoing and her cheating on him, he now became some sort of this good person. He has transcended to become a better person, if that makes sense. So that makes me think a lot about whether or not forgiving is for their sake or for our own sake, because I feel like what Tolstoy is getting at, or what I understand him to be getting at, is how if we don't forgive other people, it's like we're also not forgiving ourselves, because we just keep holding on to that burden. But once we release that burden and forgive other people, that's we're also forgiving ourselves and accepting that even though if that imperfection comes from other people wrongdoing, they still can have an effect on us, and that's okay. But I do feel like this is not as scary or intimidating like other people mention. I'm actually enjoying it, and I'm actually surprised that Tolstoy could be this comprehensible. Okay, last tip is make reading enjoyable, especially when you're reading classic. By all means, romanticizing it to the max. You can light a candle, brew some tea, make a matcha, have a cup of coffee, create an ambiance, music, playlists, white noise, background, fireplace, video on YouTube, whatever feels right to you. Make sure that you are enjoying the reading experience of a classic. I feel like that's very important. I feel like reading should be enjoyable, and sometimes if the book is not enjoyable, we can control other things like creating an ambiance, making sure that we are romanticizing the act of reading, especially at the beginning stage. And then once you build up the momentum, you can go about reading without an ambiance. And especially if you're a student like me, it's pretty tight on budget, for example, to buy a reading chair or to do some crazy lamps or to have a bookshelf in my duplex, which that's not the case. But to the best of your ability, ask yourself, what are the things that I could do in my financial budget, but also my physical space budget, that could make me feel a little bit more enjoyable and inclined towards reading. That for me would be lighting the candle, having my bed reading lamp on, and then having a cozy blanket over myself, and then having some soft music playing in the background. Not too much because I get distracted very easily. That to me is an ambiance already, but ambiance can look very different from person to person. Even though you look on social media and you feel like, okay, that person has a whole ass reading chair, I have to have that chair. No, making sure that you're not going out of budget just to read. I think that's not the case. Just start and then you can build from there. And then if you want to, you can search up like photos and aesthetic on Pinterest. I think one of the perks of reading classics is that they're pretty well known, and so they have very aesthetic pictures on Pinterest to create a mood board, a vision board for each of the books. I think that's a very cute thing that I want to try, but I'm too lazy enough to try. And then same thing, a playlist if you want to listen to music. And then the last thing that I have is dedicate a time period to reading classics and make sure that in that time you have to sit down and read. One thing that reading classics can have a toll on people is they seem to be very intimidating at first. Like, look at that amount of pages. But make sure that I have an hour and a half every single day dedicated to reading this particular classic. And then after time, you're gonna make progress and you're gonna feel like, oh, this is not as intimidating as I thought. But the point is, at the beginning, make sure that you are dedicating and actively and forcing yourself in a good way to read. Anna Karenina reading update. I am on page 552. The goal for myself that I have was to finish the book today, but I don't think it's possible. I still have like 200-ish pages left, and I don't think I should rush it. So coming back to whatever we preach at the beginning, we don't have to feel guilty about taking a bit slower to read this book. But so far, it's been very interesting. I feel like these people are just like full-on gossipy and full-on, they have so many problems that I was like, your life is so interesting. Every single day, things happen to this group of people, and the things that happen to them is just very much mundane. They talk about navigating betrayal, love, marriage, children, parenting, motherhood. Each person and each character in this story has their own little story and has their own little background. Really, up until this point that I'm reading the book, I feel like I can never judge somebody just by their appearances, especially the characters in this story, because they all have their own little story going on, except Anna Karenina. I don't like her. I feel like she doesn't have anything else to do except be a good person, but she is not a good person. At some point, I was debating whether or not she is a good mother as well, but then I feel like that topic is still under discussion. I had this very interesting thought and question about just like mother in general, in that how could you determine whether or not you should choose your passion and following your will, and when should you do that for the sake of your children and your child. But I also feel a lot for Alexei Alexandrovich, which is her husband, and I feel like it's unfair that he's being treated so badly because his wife cheated on him. He's such a special character for me. I feel like people are not doing him justice. There's a lot more commentary on art now, comparing contemporary art to artists and painters like Raphael or Michelangelo, all of those fun stuff, and I felt included in this discussion about art and contemporary art, and that was very reassuring. I want to close this video off by saying that reading is something that should be honored. And if you're somebody who wants to start reading more in 2025, especially getting into more classics, I think you should treat classics like how they deserve to be treated. Usually when we look at these books, we tend to look at them as just books. But I feel like these books, especially classics, they are an entire person's lifetime. Some people, some authors can spend their entire lifetime, 10 years, 20 years, 15 years, just to write a single book. And the amount of time, dedication, effort, meaning, significance that go into every single classic is tremendous. And I feel like you should appreciate that and appreciate the fact that books carry knowledge and books are something that should be nourished. Reading also should be treated as such. And I think that once you make that switch in your mindset, you're gonna feel like reading is so much more easy, in my opinion, and respectable. Just like how you would treat a friend. Would you treat your friend with disrespect, broken promises, or would you spend time with your friend friend? Would you like to actively sit down and get to know your friend? Just reframing that is very important, especially if you look at these books. There are people behind these pages. Tolstoy wrote this book when he was 45, and it took him years to finish this book. I think they are an entire lifetime of dedication, passion, and commitment. Okay, I finished Anna Karenina a couple of hours ago, like 1 or 2 hours ago, and I think this is a solid 4 stars from me. I thought this book was gonna be full-on existential crisis, but it actually ended on such a good note. Although I do have to confess that the last, I think, 50 pages or so were very boring. I could not keep up with what they were talking about, but then the very last couple of pages, I really feel like I could understand what Levin was going through. This book basically follows him as he kind of grows on his journey of becoming a man, but also becoming kind of mature emotionally, but also mentally, because some of the questions that he posed were very much interesting questions about existence, about the purpose of life, about religion, if and how you can be a non-believer in a society where Christianity was very much prominent and people were believers and you were the only person who didn't believe in God, and how he kind of navigate with his faith, his religion. I think this is one of those books that will make me think a lot and will live in my head for quite some time and make me think not only about art, wealth, class, rank, but also just like life in general, existence. What does it mean to be a good person and the common good of people, and just like all those topics that are very much important topics. So I would recommend reading this book, Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy. It is surprisingly easy, to be honest, in coming from me. Check your trigger warnings, or at least know the premise going to this book, but I think you should give it a read. Okay, so that's everything that I have in terms of how to get into classics without getting overwhelmed and feeling like you are behind, feeling guilty. Some tips recap would be, remember, you don't have to read classics fast. Take your time with it, be immersed in the story and meeting the characters, making sure you understand their context, their background. Second, you don't have to love every single page. You don't have to understand every single thing about classics. They are classics for a reason. So as long as you finish them and you realize 1 or 2 things about the book, that's good enough, at least on the first read. Third, you are allowed to read slowly. You are allowed to put the book down. You're allowed to take a break. You're allowed to read 1 page a day. That's still reading. But as long as you keep reading, as long as you keep making progress through the book, and as long as you keep making sure that you're enjoying reading, that's what matters. So that's all I have. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here and staying until the end of the video. I'm very much honored, and I hope you found all the tips and my reading updates and my reading experience with Anna Karenina very, very useful. It was so much fun doing this vlog, and I've been really enjoying creating content, and I hope that you're also enjoying seeing me speak and talk about books. Books are just, I just love books. I hope this video helps you feel more confident about picking up a classic, whether it's Anna Karenina or something completely different. Let me know down in the comment section what classics you're reading or what classics you've been wanting to read, and we can have a discussion. You know, if you have any other British literature classics recommendations, I would love to hear, because I just love British literature. Let's chat in the comment section, and if you like this video and you would like to see more from me, my face, my channel, then give me a follow, give me a like, give me a share, give me a comment. You know the drill. And then I will see you very soon with another episode, and until then, happy reading. Bye bye.